A torrential storm. A desperate knock at midnight. David opened his cabin door to find a wounded Apache woman bleeding onto his porch. He thought she just needed a warm fire and one single night of shelter. He was dead wrong. She brought a storm far deadlier than the rain. The year was 1888, and the San Simon Valley was drowning. For 3 days and 3 nights, a relentless deluge had hammered the parched Arizona earth, turning the dusty plains into a treacherous sea of thick red mud. Inside his isolated timber cabin, 30 miles from the nearest semblance of civilization, David Pendleton sat by a dying hearth. He was a man chiseled from the harshness of the frontier, broad-shouldered, quiet, with hands heavily calloused from years of wrangling cattle, and a gaze hardened by the lingering ghosts of the cavalry. David was methodically oiling the lever action of his Winchester repeater, where his hound, a battered blue heeler named Barnaby, suddenly let out a low, vibrating growl. The dog's hackles raised, his eyes fixed on the heavy oak door. The wind was howling, rattling the window pane so violently it sounded like breaking glass. But beneath the roar of the gale, David heard it. Thump, thump, thump. Faint, desperate knocking. David's grip tightened on the Winchester. Out here, visitors at midnight in the middle of a monsoon were never bringing good news. They were either desperate men running from a posse or outlaws looking for an easy claim. He stood up, his boots echoing on the pine floorboards, and chambered around with a sharp metallic clack. He unlatched the heavy iron bolt and pulled the door inward, bracing himself against the howling wind. A body collapsed across the threshold, tumbling directly at his boots. David quickly kicked the door shut, barring the storm outside, and knelt down. It was a woman. She was soaked to the bone, her long, raven-black hair plastered across her face, shivering violently. She wore a heavy, soaked pioneer dress of faded blue cotton, but beneath the hem David spotted the unmistakable beadwork of traditional Apache moccasins. Tension coiled in his gut. Tensions in the territory were at a boiling point. The San Carlos Reservation was a powder keg, and any white rancher caught harboring an Apache off-reservation, especially in this valley, was asking for a hangman's noose. Local cattle barons, particularly the ruthless Josiah Sterling, had made it abundantly clear that native blood spilled on their land was considered a favor to progress. "Mister," she whispered, her voice trembling but her English shockingly clear and unaccented. "Please." It was then David saw the blood. It was pooling rapidly on his floorboards, washing out with the rainwater dripping off her dress. She was clutching her right side, her fingers slick with crimson. "You've been shot," David said gruffly, laying his rifle on the table. He lifted her effortlessly and carried her to the worn leather armchair near the fireplace. He threw 2 fresh logs onto the embers and stoked them into a blazing fire. Grabbing his medical kit, a rudimentary tin box of bandages, carbolic acid, and a pair of iron forceps, he returned to her side. "I need to see the wound," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. She hesitated, her dark, piercing eyes locking onto his. In that flickering firelight, David was struck by her striking features, high cheekbones, a sharp jawline, and an undeniable, fierce resilience radiating from her despite the pain. She slowly moved her hand away. "My name is Sarah," she gritted out through clenched teeth as David cut away the ruined fabric of her dress. "David," he replied, cleaning the area with a rag soaked in whiskey. "And you didn't get this from a stray branch, Sarah. That's a clean puncture. Ah, .44 caliber," she whispered, her breathing shallow. "I was hunted." David paused, his heart skipping a beat. A .44 caliber was standard issue for the local deputies and the hired guns working for Josiah Sterling. "I don't want trouble, Sarah. I run a quiet spread. The law around here doesn't look kindly on your people, and they look even worse on white men who take them in." "I only want shelter," she pleaded, reaching out and gripping his forearm with surprising strength. "Just for one night. Let me rest. Let the storm break, and I will be gone before the sun crests the ridge. You will never see me again." David looked at the blood staining his hands, then at her desperate, exhausted face. Against his better judgment, against every survival instinct the frontier had beaten into him, he nodded. "Bite down on this," he commanded, handing her a thick leather strap. "The bullet is still in there. It hit a rib and stopped, but if I don't dig it out, the fever will kill you before the law does." For the next hour, the cabin was filled with the sickening sounds of metal scraping bone and the muffled, agonizing groans of the Apache woman. Sarah bore the excruciating pain with a stoicism that left David deeply impressed. When he finally dropped the deformed lead slug into a tin cup, she was pale and drenched in sweat, but alive. He stitched the wound, bound it tightly with clean linen, and covered her in his thickest wool blankets. As she drifted into an exhausted sleep by the crackling fire, David sat in the chair opposite her, his Winchester resting across his lap. He watched her chest rise and fall, wondering what kind of hell she was running from and how much of it was about to land right on his doorstep. David awoke to a blinding shaft of morning sunlight piercing through the cabin window. The storm had broken, leaving behind a profound, eerie silence over the San Simon Valley. He blinked the sleep from his eyes and immediately sat up, his hand instinctively gripping the stock of his rifle. The hearth was nothing but cold, gray ash. The heavy wool blankets were folded neatly on the armchair. Sarah was gone. A strange, hollow pang of disappointment hit David's chest, quickly overshadowed by a wave of intense relief. She had kept her word. She had survived the night and vanished into the dawn, leaving him out of whatever deadly game she was playing. He stretched his stiff back and walked toward the iron stove to boil some coffee. As he passed the rustic dining table, his boot struck something heavy underneath it. Plink. David frowned. He knelt down and pulled back the wooden chair. Shoved deep into the shadows beneath the table was a thick, dark leather saddlebag. It wasn't his. Intricate tooling bordered the flap, and stamped proudly in the center was the insignia of the United States Cavalry. His stomach dropped. With trembling hands, David unbuckled the straps and threw the flap open. Inside were neat, tightly bound stacks of greenbacks. Thousands of dollars. It was the missing Fort Bowie payroll, a massive sum of government money that the entire county had been buzzing about. The stagecoach carrying it had been robbed 3 days ago, leaving 2 soldiers dead. Lord Almighty, David breathed, stumbling backward. But the money wasn't the worst part. Lying at the bottom of the saddlebag, nestled beneath the stacks of cash, was a silver star. It was smeared with dried blood. David picked it up, reading the engraved lettering, Harlan Cole, Deputy Sheriff, Cochise County. Cold panic washed over him. Sarah hadn't just come here for shelter. She had used his home as a dead drop. Or worse, she had intentionally planted the stolen payroll and the blooded badge of a murdered lawman in his cabin to frame him. Before David could even begin to process the betrayal, Barnaby erupted into a vicious frenzy of barking. David sprinted to the window and peered through the dusty glass. Riding up the muddy trail toward his property was a posse of 6 heavily armed men. They rode in a tight, disciplined formation, their long coats caked in fresh red mud. At the front rode Josiah Sterling, his silver-tipped boots gleaming in the sun, a man who essentially owned the local law. And riding right beside him, looking pale but very much alive, was Deputy Harlan Cole. Cole's coat was open, revealing a heavily bandaged shoulder and an empty spot on his chest where his badge used to be. "Damn it," David hissed. He had less than 30 seconds. He grabbed the heavy saddlebag, rushed to the pantry, and pried up a loose floorboard he used for storing root vegetables in the winter. He shoved the leather bag deep into the dark earth beneath the cabin, slammed the board back down, and kicked a sack of flour over the seam. By the time the heavy fists pounded on his front door, David was standing by the stove, casually pouring a steaming cup of coffee. He opened the door to find Deputy Cole blaring at him, a shotgun resting casually in the crook of his arm. Behind him, Sterling sat atop his massive black stallion, chewing on a cigar, his eyes scanning David's property like a vulture. "Morning, David," Cole said, his voice a low, gravelly threat. "Mind if we step inside?" "You're already stepping, Harlan," David replied coolly, taking a sip of his coffee. "What brings the county's finest all the way out to my spread after a washout?" Sterling urged his horse a step closer. "We're hunting an animal, Pendleton. An Apache girl. She ambushed Deputy Cole last night near the ridge. Shot him, stole his tin star, and took off with the Fort Bowie payroll she and her renegade friends stole 3 days ago." David maintained his composure, keeping his heart rate steady. "An Apache girl took down a stagecoach and ambushed a deputy. Sounds like you boys are losing your touch." Cole sneered, stepping further into the cabin. His eyes darted around the room, landing momentarily on the bloodstain David hadn't entirely managed to scrub from the floorboards near the hearth. "What's that?" Cole asked, pointing the barrel of his shotgun at the dark stain. "Gutted a rabbit," David lied smoothly. "Barnaby caught it just before the storm hit. Skinned it right there." Cole didn't look convinced. He walked over, his boots tracking mud onto the floor, and stared down at the dark spot. "A rabbit bleeds a lot, David." "It was a big rabbit." Sterling spat a stream of tobacco juice onto David's porch. "Listen carefully, Pendleton. General Miles is looking for an excuse to move the cavalry in and clear the rest of those savages out of the valley for good. This robbery is all the excuse he needs. Anyone found harboring that girl or hiding government property isn't going to stand trial. They're going to swing from the nearest cottonwood. And I haven't seen a soldier, sire," David said, holding the wealthy baron's gaze. "Just me and the dog. If an Apache girl with a bullet in her—" "I never said I shot her," Cole interrupted, his eyes narrowing to dangerous slits. David's blood turned to ice. He had slipped. "I assumed," David recovered smoothly. "If she ambushed you, I'd hope to God you managed to get a shot off, Harlan." The deputy stared at him for a long, agonizing moment before finally lowering the shotgun. "We're going to search your barn. If she's here, Pendleton, you're a dead man." David watched from the doorway as the posse tore through his outbuildings. They kicked over feed barrels, thrust pitchforks into the hayloft, and spooked his horses. After 20 tense minutes, they mounted back up. "Keep your eyes open," David Sterling warned, turning his horse. "There's a $500 bounty on her head. Alive or dead, mostly dead." David waited until the posse was just a speck on the horizon before he let out a shaking breath. The moment they were gone, he threw on his coat and stormed out to the barn. He needed to saddle his horse, dig up that money, and bury it 10 miles deep in the desert. If they came back with a search warrant and found it under his floorboards, his life was over. He threw open the barn doors, grabbed his favorite saddle off the wooden rack, and turned toward his Ron gelding. Suddenly, the cold, unmistakable ring of a revolver hammer being cocked echoed through the dusty barn. A heavy iron barrel pressed firmly against the base of David's skull. "Do not turn around, cowboy," a soft, familiar voice whispered from the shadows behind him. David froze, the heavy saddle slipping slightly in his grip. It was Sarah. She hadn't left the property. She had used the cabin as a decoy and had been hiding in his barn the entire time the posse was tearing it apart. "You set me up," David growled, his voice vibrating with anger. "You left the payroll in my kitchen. You left a dead man's badge under my roof." "I left you leverage," Sarah replied, the gun unwavering against his neck. "And he is not a dead man, as you just saw. Deputy Cole and Josiah Sterling are the ones who robbed the Fort Bowie stagecoach, David. They murdered the soldiers. I was hiding in the canyon and saw the whole thing. They shot me because I'm a witness, and they planted the blame on my tribe so the army will wipe my people out, and Sterling can take the copper beneath our lands." David's mind reeled as the puzzle pieces slammed into place. "I didn't bring trouble to your door to destroy you, David," she whispered, her free hand reaching around his waist to disarm him, pulling his Colt out of his holster. I brought the money to you because you are the only white man in this valley I heard was honorable enough to hate Josiah Sterling as much as I do. Now, are you going to help me expose them, or am I going to have to shoot you too?" David did not flinch. The cold steel of the revolver pressed against his skin was a stark reminder of the unforgiving land he inhabited, a land where trust was usually paid for in blood. He slowly exhaled, letting the heavy saddle slide from his hands to hit the straw-covered floor with a muted thud. "If I wanted you dead, Sarah," David said, his voice deadly calm, "I would have pointed Harlan Cole directly to this barn. And if you wanted to shoot me, you would have done it the second I walked through those doors instead of talking to me." For a breathless moment, the silence in the barn was absolute, broken only by the nervous shifting of the roan gelding. Then, slowly, the pressure of the barrel against David's neck eased. He turned around, his hands kept carefully at his sides. Sarah looked worse than she had the night before. The adrenaline that had sustained her was wearing off. Her face was the color of old parchment, and her hand, the one gripping David's heavy coat, was visibly trembling. The blood from her reopened wound was beginning to stain the fresh linen David had bound her in. "Josiah Sterling wants the copper running through the Dragoon Mountains," Sarah continued, her voice losing its edge, replaced by a desperate weariness. "But my people's reservation borders those foothills. The only way he gets the mining rights is if the United States government voids the treaty. And the only way the government voids the treaty is if the Apache break it first." David finished the thought, the dark reality settling over him like a suffocating blanket. A brutal stagecoach robbery, 2 dead soldiers, the theft of a massive federal payroll. It's the perfect excuse. General Nelson Miles will march the cavalry in and slaughter every man, woman, and child in your camp before the week is out. Sarah swayed on her feet, the heavy revolver suddenly too much for her weakened grip. It slipped from her fingers. David lunged forward, catching her by the waist before she could hit the ground. She felt incredibly fragile in his arms, yet he knew she possessed a spirit forged from iron. "I tried to ride to Tombstone," she whispered, leaning her weight against his chest, "to bring the money to United States Marshal Evander Cross. He is a federal man. He does not answer to Josiah Sterling. But Cole's men caught me in the canyon. I managed to lose them in the storm, but I knew my horse would not make it, and neither would I. I saw your light." David looked down at her. He had spent his entire life keeping his head down, minding his cattle, and surviving by looking the other way. But as he stared into Sarah's fierce, desperate eyes, he realized that looking away was no longer an option. A man who let innocent people hang for a rich man's greed was no man at all. "Tombstone is a 50-mile ride through hostile desert," David said softly, effortlessly lifting her into his arms. "And if Sterling suspects you survived, he'll have every cutthroat on his payroll watching the trails." "Then I will die on the trails," she replied stubbornly, though her eyes were fluttering shut. "No, you won't," David said, carrying her back toward the cabin. "We ride at dusk. We take the high pass through the Dragoons. It's treacherous, but Sterling's riders are valley men. They won't risk their horses in the jagged rock. I know a federal judge in Tucson, Judge Horace Carter. If we can get him the money and Cole's badge, he can issue a federal warrant for Sterling." David kicked the cabin door open, but as he stepped over the threshold, Barnaby's ears pinned back, and the hound let out a ferocious, snapping snarl directed toward the tree line. David's survival instincts flared. He dropped to his knees, pulling Sarah down with him just as a deafening crack echoed across the valley. The cabin window exploded inward, showering them in glass. A .45 to 90 Winchester rifle slug tore through the air where David's chest had been a fraction of a second earlier, burying itself deep into the brickwork of the fireplace. "Get down!" David roared, shielding a body with his own. Sterling hadn't trusted David after all. He had left a man behind to watch the property. David scrambled across the glass-strewn floor, reaching his own rifle leaning against the kitchen table. He peeked over the windowsill. 100 yards out, concealed behind a cluster of mesquite bushes, a faint plume of gray smoke was dissipating in the wind. It was Caleb Miller, one of Sterling's most notorious hired guns, chambering another round. "He's pinning us down," David muttered, checking his magazine. "If he keeps us here until dark, Sterling will send the rest of the posse back." Sarah, grimacing in pain, crawled toward the fallen Colt revolver David had dropped near the door. She checked the cylinder, her movements practiced and precise. "You have a back door, David. Leads to the root cellar, but it's an open sprint to the tree line." "I do not need to sprint," Sarah said, her dark eyes flashing with a dangerous fire. "I just need to give you a distraction. When I start shooting, you get on your horse." "I'm not leaving you here," David snapped. "You are not leaving me," she corrected, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "You are bringing the horses around to the back. Go." Before David could argue, Sarah kicked the front door open with her boot. She didn't expose herself, but thrust the Colt around the doorframe, fanning the hammer. 3 thunderous shots rang out in rapid succession, kicking up dirt and splintering the mesquite wood where Miller was hiding. Miller immediately returned fire, unleashing a barrage of lead into the front of the cabin, focused entirely on the doorway. David didn't waste the window. He bolted out the rear door, sprinting low and hard toward the barn. Bullets whizzed past the cabin, but Miller was completely distracted by Sarah's suppressing fire. David threw open the barn doors, grabbed his roan and a sturdy gray mare, and swung into the saddle. He spurred the roan hard, leading the mare by the reins, galloping violently around the rear of the cabin. "Sarah, come on," he yelled over the gunfire. Sarah burst from the back door, stumbling as her wound sent a jolt of agony through her leg. David leaned down from his saddle, his powerful arm wrapping around her waist, and practically hoisted her onto the gray mare as they rode past. They didn't look back. They rode hard into the blinding Arizona sun, leaving the shattered cabin and the furious shouts of Caleb Miller in the dust. The devil's bargain was sealed. There was no turning back now. The journey through the Dragoon Mountains was a brutal crucible. For 3 days, David and Sarah navigated treacherous, jagged canyons, staying off the main trails to evade Sterling's patrols. In the quiet isolation of the high desert, beneath a canopy of brilliant stars, the boundaries between the hardened cowboy and the hunted Apache woman dissolved. Why risk everything for a stranger? Sarah asked softly one night by a smokeless fire, her fierce eyes softening with gratitude. "I've spent my life looking the other way," David replied, gently brushing a raven lock from her cheek. "I realize that doing nothing is just another way of pulling the trigger." When their lips met, it was a desperate collision of 2 souls, a silent vow to see this through, together. By the 4th afternoon, they rode into dusty Tucson and walked straight into the office of United States Marshal Evander Cross. "We brought you the devil, Marshal," David said, slamming the stolen saddlebag onto the desk. He tossed Harlan Cole's bloodied silver star beside the stacks of federal greenbacks. "Josiah Sterling and his deputy slaughtered those soldiers," Sarah stated firmly. "Check the deputy's shoulder. You'll find my .44 slug missing." Before Cross could process the heavy accusation, the courthouse windows shattered. A hail of gunfire erupted from the street. "Get down," Cross bellowed, diving behind his mahogany desk as David tackled Sarah to the floor. Outside, Josiah Sterling and a half-dozen hired guns had tracked them down. "Send the girl out, Pentelton," Sterling roared over the gunfire. David didn't answer with words. He vaulted up, racking his Winchester and firing twice, dropping one of Sterling's men. Marshal Cross, infuriated by the attack, grabbed a double-barreled shotgun from his wall. "No one shoots up my courthouse." A chaotic, deafening shootout consumed the street. Sarah laid down brutal suppressive fire from the window, forcing the posse into a panic. Harlan Cole tried to flee down an alley on horseback, but David leapt through the shattered window, took a breath, and shot the deputy's horse out from under him. Cole hit the dust violently, groaning and disarmed. Seeing his men dead or defeated, Josiah Sterling dropped his revolvers and raised his trembling hands as Marshal Cross marched out, leveling his shotgun directly at the Baron's chest. 2 weeks later, the San Simon Valley was finally at peace. Sterling and Cole awaited the hangman in a federal penitentiary, and the cavalry had withdrawn from the reservation borders. Standing on the porch of his repaired cabin, David wrapped his arm around Sarah as they watched the sunset paint the Arizona sky. The storm had brought her to his door, bleeding and hunted, but it had passed, leaving behind a beautiful, untamed horizon, and the woman who had forever captured his frontier heart. Did David and Sarah's wild frontier romance leave you breathless? The Wild West was built on dangerous secrets and untamed love, and this is just one of many untold stories. If you loved this thrilling tale of justice and passion, hit that like button, share it with your fellow history buffs, and subscribe to our channel for more epic real-life historical dramas. Don't miss our next video.